Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I would yield myself up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to talk just a moment about the ill-considered proposal that we'll be voting on at 6:15 tonight, and about the administration's chaotic approach when it comes to national energy policy. I say chaotic approach because to pay attention to what the President and this administration have said about fossil fuels and energy will give you whiplash if you try to keep up with it, because so many apparently inconsistencies between what is said and what is actually done. And then when something like high gasoline prices becomes very much a concern around kitchen tables in America, then all of a sudden the President, again, as he announced the last day or two, that he's all of a sudden open for more domestic production here in America. But it is a problem for a number of reasons. One is that who in their right mind would invest the kind of money that is necessary in order to develop our domestic energy reserves when the administration and the President himself seem to be of two minds about whether we should punish domestic production or whether we should encourage it. And I would suggest to you that the message has primarily been one of how to discourage or how to punish domestic production of energy in favor of imported energy from abroad. For example, one of the mixed messages the President gave was in March of 2010 when he proposed expanding offshore drilling along the Atlantic coastline, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, near my home in Texas, and the north coast of Alaska. At that time, he said as follows. He said, the answer is not drilling everywhere all the time, but the answer is not also for us to ignore the fact that we're going to need vital energy sources to maintain our economic growth and our security. Well, I agree with that statement. But as you know, following the Deepwater Horizon incident last April, the administration overreacted in a way that killed jobs and discouraged energy production here at home. Now, we all agree that when something like this terrible incident occurs, we need to find out what happened, fix it, and make sure it never happens again. But every time there's a car accident, we don't ban driving. Every time there's an airplane crash, we don't ban flying. We find out what the problem is, we fix it, and then we move on. And that's not what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. First, there was an overbroad moratorium that was issued by the administration, which ultimately ended up being struck down by a federal judge. But after that, the administration was not through. Where their formal moratorium no longer existed, there was in effect a permit-torium, in other words, foot-dragging when it came to issuing permits for drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And only 12 deepwater permits have been approved in the last 12 months, only 12. There were, in addition, cancellation of dozens of lease sales in Utah and Montana, and exclusion of new areas in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and off the Atlantic coast. That, to me, is completely inconsistent with the President's statement just in March 2010. And then we know there are numerous examples where the Environmental Protection Agency has thrown up roadblocks and impediments to energy production right here at home. Well, because the President has not had an adequate response, or at least his actions have been inconsistent with his words, he reversed himself again this Saturday, and he said now he supports more domestic oil and gas production like he did more than a year ago. But my conclusion, Madam President, is this is not an energy strategy. This is a public relations strategy. This is a how do I get reelected strategy. It does not solve the problem or the pain that Americans are feeling at the pump. And unfortunately, this strategy too often ends up being a job-killing strategy as well. But when high gas prices are in the news, when people around kitchen tables all around America are complaining about the loss of their discretionary income, the fact they're having to cut corners so they can drive their kids to school or they can drive to work, finally we have a new speech and a new announcement from the administration. but very little when it comes to a coherent energy strategy. Another mixed message is that the administration at times have suggested that we have actually overproducing domestic energy. And you may ask, how could that be possible? How could it be possible that we are producing too much oil and gas here at home when we have to import 60% of what we use from abroad? Well, the Congressional Research Service that we depend on, it's an arm of the Library of Congress, has documented that America's recoverable resources are far larger than those of Saudi Arabia, China, and Canada combined. We have more here at home than Saudi Arabia, China, and Canada. And America's recoverable oil, natural gas, and coal endowment is the largest on Earth. And we've learned in the last couple of years that America has more shale gas from previously unrecoverable reserves thanks to new technology, horizontal drilling and the like. We've got enough natural gas to last us for 100 years here in the United States. But compare that, really that gift we've been given of domestic energy at home with what the administration said just in 2010. The Treasury Department issues an interpretation or explanation of the administration's policies when it talks about energy production, and this is what the Treasury Department said in 2009 for 2010. The Treasury Department, this is Secretary Geithner, is appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, but the Treasury Department said to the extent the tax credit, and that's the tax credits we're talking about here, encourage overproduction of oil and gas, it is detrimental to long-term energy security. So the Treasury Department, President Obama's Treasury Department, are making an extraordinary claim that I have not heard any senator make here because it is so implausible, that these tax provisions encourage overproduction of oil and gas right here in the United States. If we are overproducing oil and gas in the United States, why is the administration telling existing leaseholders they have to use or lose the leases that we have? It is an ideological fixation that says we have to discourage production of oil and gas, even though about 80% of our energy needs come from fossil fuels, because we prefer alternative forms of energy. Well, I do too. You know, solar panels, wind, biodiesel, these alternative sources of energy are important, but we simply don't have enough of them to keep our economy moving and to remain and keep prices low for our domestic production, or domestic consumers, I should say. Well, another part of this mixed message is our dependency on imported oil. On March the 30th, 2011, President Obama was called for reducing foreign imports by a third. But then he went to Brazil recently when he told the people of Brazil that he encouraged offshore drilling in Brazil. And he said that America wanted to be Brazil's best customer. In other words, rather than producing what we have been given by the good Lord right here in America, American production, American jobs, he wants us to be Brazil's best customer by importing energy from abroad. Well, part of the vote that we'll be having at 6:15 or so tonight is another part of the mixed messages that we've been getting when it comes to energy. This is the so-called Close Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act. Now, we know why the senators who introduced this bill have done so, because they've been getting so much heat back home because of high gas prices. Their constituents are demanding that they do something. But what they are proposing to do has nothing to do with bringing down the price of gas at the pump. In fact, it will likely increase the price of gas at the pump. In fact, the chairman of the Finance Committee, on which I sit, he said, you know, this is not going to change the price at the gasoline pump. That's not the issue. I don't see that as an issue at all. The senior senator from New York said this was never intended to talk about lowering prices. The majority leader himself said it's not a question of gas prices. It's a question of fairness and priorities. Well, Madam President, if gasoline prices being paid by Americans all across this country aren't the priority, and if jobs that are created and sustained by producing domestic oil and gas right here in America aren't the priority, my colleagues who are proposing this legislation have the wrong priority. Well, now we're told they've got a new idea, that the money that's supposedly saved from these tax provisions will then be used to pay down the deficit. But the truth is, the amount of money that would go to, quote, pay down the deficit, even if our friends across the aisle had a conversion and decided that that was their priority, rather than spending 43 cents on every dollar in borrowed money, borrowed from our kids and grandkids and bought by the Chinese, it would only be a drop in the bucket in the $1.5 trillion deficit that we are experiencing this year, and the $14 trillion national debt that we're going to have to reckon with in the next couple of months. If deficit reduction is the priority, I submit the very best way we could do that is to pass a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. But that's not the priority of the majority leader or of the majority or of our friends across the aisle. So if the rationale for this bill is not to reduce gasoline prices, if the rationale to this bill is not to produce a balanced budget, then what is it? What is it? Well, the majority leader suggested it was fairness. Fairness. Well, the Chamber of Commerce, United States Chamber of Commerce, calls it punitive taxation. Picking out 5 taxpayers in America saying we're going to raise your taxes and leave everybody else's the same is discriminatory and it is punitive. But it also, in the immortal words of Rahm Emanuel, former White House Chief of Staff, now the mayor of Chicago, I guess it never lets a crisis, it's a case of never letting a crisis go to waste to advance another ideological agenda. But the truth is, we know that our tax code is already biased against U.S. domestic energy producers. And if your goal is to tax people who are making money in America, this chart demonstrates that the oil and gas industry is down the list of industry sectors that are making far more money. The tobacco and beverage industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the computer equipment industry, the chemical industry, the electrical equipment industry, the manufacturing industry, the apparel industry, the machinery sector, all of those come well ahead of the oil and gas sector when it comes to making money. But you know, I didn't think making money was a crime in America. I thought we still believe in the free enterprise system, and the very people that our friends across the aisle are going to be punishing are the retirees and the pension holders, the people who own stock in these oil and gas companies that are going to be forced to pay higher prices and ultimately be passed along to the consumer, I believe, in higher energy costs. Well, the other revealing thing about this debate is they want to punish people who produce American energy right here at home, and they're going to leave OPEC and these other countries to pay lower effective relative rates. So if you raise taxes on American producers and you don't do anything to similarly raise taxes on their competition, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the Saudi Arabian Oil Company? What's going to happen to the Iraq National Oil Company, the Kuwait Petroleum Company, the state-owned oil company of Venezuela, and the like? These are places where we end up buying oil because we don't produce it at home, and we're going to raise taxes on the people who produce it at home and to make it, in effect, cheaper on domestic energy producers to produce it and sell it to us. It makes absolutely no sense. It's punitive, it's discriminatory, and it's not going to solve the problem that most America is complaining about today, which is high gasoline prices. In fact, it will make it worse.
Self-selection process.
But if my colleagues want to talk about fairness, let's talk about fairness to the 9.2 million people who are employed in the oil and gas sector in America. Now, I've witnessed the people who work in this sector in my state. In March, I visited a brand-new drilling rig that's using the very latest technology to produce natural gas from the Haynesville Shale in East Texas. Now, this is an amazing technology that goes down thousands of feet and drills horizontally and uses high-pressure fluids to fracture this shale and affect a rock to get natural gas out of it. And down in the Gulf of Mexico, after the moratorium was issued, I stood on a deep-water drilling platform that was left idle because of the...
Senator has used 15 minutes.
Madam President, I'd ask for 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I could go on and on about the economic impact on job creation in my state and across America, but if in fact our colleagues are interested in tax reform, if they really are concerned that the tax code is unfair and some people don't pay enough and others pay too much, I would just ask them to consider the fact that according to the Congressional Research Service, that 77.9% of our primary energy production in America is fossil fuel sources, and that federal tax support targeted to energy in 2009, 12.6% went to fossil fuels. 12.6% of those federal tax supports went to people who produce oil and gas. Conversely, 10.6%, the Congressional Research Service tells us, of primary source energy was produced using renewable sources. Yet the federal tax support targeted to renewable sources of energy was 77.4%. So why are we picking on American oil and gas production, forcing us, well, actually hurting job creation at a time when unemployment is unacceptably high, forcing us to rely on imported energy and actually rewarding our foreign competitors who will not have to pay this higher prices? And when, in fact, even as our friends across the aisle acknowledge at the very best this won't bring down the prices at the pump, they say that's not the point. Well, if that's not the point, then the point appears to be a game of gotcha and and the sort of finger-pointing and class warfare that we've seen that's endemic here inside the Beltway. And I have to tell you that I think the American people are sick and tired of these sort of game playing when, in fact, they send us here to solve real problems. If we could find a way, instead of this game playing, instead of this phony game of gotcha, to try to work together to solve real problems, to increase domestic supply, which would indeed bring down price at the pump, as the President himself has acknowledged when he said we have to look at domestic production, then I think they would reward that with their appreciation, and appreciation in terms of American jobs being sustained and created here, because we're not creating jobs abroad to buy the very product we need in order to run our cars and trucks. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from West Virginia.
Madam President, to me, this argument is in fact all about fairness. Has nothing to do with class warfare, has nothing to do with gotcha, but has to do with abrogation of social responsibility on the basest of levels. Every once in a while, Madam President, we have an exchange in the Senate or in a Senate committee that is revealing and stunning all at once. Recently, I had one of those moments when I had an opportunity to ask some questions to, guess what, 5 executives from the largest oil and gas companies in the country. Now, not linking price of gas, but in the people's minds it is. With the gas prices head up $4 a gallon, many people spending close to $100 a week to gas up their car, I was cautiously optimistic that we would have in this Senate Finance Committee hearing a real dialogue on the idea that everybody has shared responsibility and that you share your responsibility, in this case for the need of balancing the budget or coming closer to it, and then from that you then can share prosperity. But you've got to share responsibility first, because that's what leads to the discipline that allows prosperity generally in this country to get ahead. Now, I thought that the oil executives might at least reveal a bit of unease a bit of discomfort on their part about how gas prices are standing like a dead weight on our economy, about the fact that they make so incredibly much, inexplicably, unexplainably much money, loving that, especially when they together earned just about $35.8 billion in profits in the first 3 months of this year. How wrong I was. They were eager only to defend the way big oil does business, defend the enormous salaries, defend the business model that puts control of gas supply in the hands of a few. One wouldn't even answer when he was asked about his company's claim that trying to reduce taxpayer subsidies, which is what we want to do, given to this industry, would be un-American. He'd said that a number of times, and in that exchange, it wasn't very fruitful, but it was insightful. As I said then, put simply, these men are all completely out of touch, deeply, profoundly out of touch with what the rest of the country is going through. And that's, again, what it's about. Fairness. Do you know what other people are suffering? Your situation is this, very profitable. Other people are really going on very hard times. And isn't there some way, in this case, $2 billion a year out of the instead of making $125 billion a year profit, not just, you know, more money, but actually out of profit, $125 billion would go down to $123 billion. Would not hear of it. Would not hear of it. They are so caught up in their profits that they have lost sight of what is happening in mainstream New Hampshire and mainstream West Virginia, across our economy, in our schools, on Main Street and around the kitchen table. Well, gentlemen, the five, here's some of what you need to know. For starters, the Congress is in the midst of a full-throated debate about how to reduce our growing deficit without breaking the backs further of working families, or leaving our seniors out in the cold, literally, or reducing our support for the veterans who serve our country and children who just happen to be our future. We are debating proposals to cut back Social Security and the promise that we made to generations who have worked and want to live their final years with dignity. We're debating legislation that forces Medicare to be privatized. That would cost each senior citizen about $6,000 more per year. I hope they know that. Medicare privatized, chopped up, made an optional grant program run by states, just drastically scaled back. The Congress is debating deep cuts to federal programs ranging from highways and airports to medical research to coal mine safety inspections and money for schools. Everything. Everything. Quite simply, we're talking about making drastic cuts to programs that touch the lives of virtually every single person in this country, except for them. And these slick executives seem blind to the real-world consequences of having made almost $1 trillion in profits during the past decade, profits, and while collecting $4 billion a year in subsidies, courtesy of the very same U.S. taxpayers who I've just been talking about. The same taxpayers are also forced to pay at the pump and whose lives are being changed dramatically because of their position. Why them? Because they're a symbol. They're the top of the heap. They always prevail. They always win. They always have the lobbyists, the campaign contributions. They always can get what they want. Everybody always caves to them because they're so big as they fly around in their shiny jets. Well, I don't think it's going to be that way this time, Madam President. And the same oil executives who blanch if anyone questions their mega salaries. Speaking of salaries, it might be interesting to know that the CEO of ExxonMobil is paid $29 million a year. I'm just trying to think of the New Hampshire presiding officer's state of New Hampshire. I wonder how many people make $29 million a year just in salaries. I don't know if that includes stock options or not. During my conversation with these executives last week, we talked a little bit about how the effective tax rate on their profits is significantly lower than what average workers make in my home state of West Virginia and in the presiding officer's home state. Exxon paid a 17% effective tax rate over the past 3 years, 17%, while the average individual in my state and the presiding officer's state paid an effective rate of 20%. Now, is that class warfare? Is that gotcha? Or is that about fairness? About people doing something to help their country when the country is almost on its knees? The effective rate, to explain, is the amount of tax that you're actually paying on income earned when factoring in deductions and credits. It is a vast understatement to say that West Virginians, like many others all across the nation, are not having an easy time of it during this period of record oil company profits. And they, those five, understand perfectly well that there is no longer any justification for maintaining generous subsidies for this highly profitable industry. The public appears to feel that way, that the poll numbers are just stunning. You know, 70-30, it's not right. We should take away the subsidies. I mean, it varies according to the poll, but it's always high up, including 2-to-1 Republicans across the country who believe that they should not be able to have those tax subsidies that we are so easily giving them. They know that without a willingness to stare down sacred cows like corporate subsidies, not just with them, but with others, we won't ever be able to make progress in eliminating the massive federal deficit which is staring us in the face. Why wouldn't they care about that? So easy for them. It's called sharing, being fair. No, it doesn't work that way. The average West Virginian, again, makes $32,000 a year. They can't afford another 10 years of handouts to big oil. The current high gas prices are like a dark cloud. The working class in rural states like mine commute 25 miles or more each way every day. And high gas prices can eat heavily into their weekly paycheck, and of course they do. Things are much worse in the summer, of course, when people travel, if they can any longer afford to. I hear often from constituents who are experiencing sticker shock at the pump. Police departments, schools, hospitals, community organizations feel the pinch of rising fuel costs and the pinch of everything else that isn't coming through. Philanthropy is down, depressed economy, it's bad. Even the smallest increase can have a serious impact on family budgets and a business's bottom line. I do not mean to suggest that the oil industry profits and subsidies are the sole culprit for rising gas prices. That is correct, because taking what people say, who are industry experts and economists too, has convinced me that the big factor in rising costs of energy is the role of the speculators. And I won't get into that much now, but I will say that these speculative investors make a quick profit in betting on what the cost of a barrel of oil might be next Friday. And if they turn out to be right, they got a whole lot of money. I mean, it's stupid. It's Wall Street at its dumbest, and they've shown us several ways to be that way. They take no risk themselves. I'm not alone in thinking these speculators are driving up oil prices and creating more price volatility. I've joined with other Senate colleagues in asking the Federal Trade Commission to look closely at the role of speculators in the oil futures market and in pressing the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to get moving on a power that they already have, which is to set margins on what speculators can make, crack down, rein this in. Ultimately, what's needed in the big oil industry is a sense of fairness. It's not too much to ask. When it comes to paying taxes, when it comes to paying the price for gas, to me, fairness has always meant shared sacrifice in tough times, and shared success in good times. It's a sense of giving something for the larger good, not stopping to be competitive or not stopping being competitive or aggressive or even profitable, but at least to show for a minute that they see where we are today. If they had expressed concern about average people and then refused to take any decrease in their tax subsidies paid for by these people that I'm talking about, that wouldn't have given me much comfort, but at least it would have been just a bit of a bend. We got none of that. We like our business model. We're staying with our, don't punish us for being profitable. We do business the way we do business. We've been doing it for 130 years, and that's that. So what's needed here is a reminder that a lifetime of always beating their adversaries, of never losing or giving anything of themselves to the greater good does not, in fact, lead to a prosperous, cost, or morally just society. That's not too much to ask, especially of big oil, and I'm not going to stop just because they don't get it yet. I thank the presiding officer and yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, across this country, Americans are feeling the pain at the pump. Gas prices are approaching $4 a gallon. Families are going to spend, on average, about $800 more on gas this year than they did last year. Unrest in the Middle East and a weak dollar is driving oil prices even higher. Now, more than ever, we must produce more American energy. We need to do this to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And Americans are looking to Washington for leadership. Madam President, all you have to do is pick up today's USA Today to know how much, and I know you hear about it too when you're home on the weekends, how much this $4 a gallon gas is impacting people in our states. Poll, gas prices hurting many. $4 a gallon clamp requires cutbacks. Well, let me just read to you, Madam President. As gas prices hover near $4 a gallon, nearly 7 in 10 Americans say the high cost of fuel is causing financial hardship for their families. This is a new USA Today Gallup poll. More than half say that they have made major changes to compensate for the higher prices, ranging from shorter trips to cutting back on vacation travel. It goes on. For 21%, the impact is so dramatic, they say, that their standard of living is jeopardized. So here we have families all across the country, in your state as well as in mine, families who are dealing with kids, bills, mortgage, and this sort of increase, $800 out of their ability to pay for other things this year, clearly impacts their quality of life. Well, Americans want answers, and they deserve answers. They want to know, how am I going to pay my gas bill? Well, when we have American energy right here in this country, they say, why are we so dependent on foreign countries for our energy? Well, they want to know, where is the leadership in Washington? Well, this very week, the President has finally said that he understands the need to produce more American energy. Well, you know, he's used that same line many times before. The actions of the Democratic Party today on the floor of the United States Senate do not track with the lines coming out of the White House. The administration wants Americans to believe that the administration has seen the light. But you know, Republican Representative Doc Hastings, member of the House of Representatives, has already called their bluff. Representative Hastings is the sponsor of legislation that would allow more energy production off the coast of Alaska. And he said that it is, quote, ironic, he said, that the White House is now supporting this idea. He said because the White House just recently opposed the idea when he introduced it in the House of Representatives. Now, you know, the Associated Press was even more direct. They said that all of the administration's ideas had come from 3 bills that were passed by the Republican-controlled House down the hall. And the Associated Press said that the White House had opposed every single one of these bills. So despite acting against the production of more American energy just a week ago, the President now wants us to believe that he supports it just because this week he says so. Well, I hope that his change of heart is sincere, but I have my doubts. Because unlike energy, talk is cheap. Madam President, the administration is trying to use this sudden change of heart as a bargaining chip to pass legislation that was brought up by liberals in the Senate this past week. Unlike increased production, the bill on the floor now by the Democrats will not help the American people. In fact, the bill is clear evidence that the Democratic Party has no plan to address high gasoline prices. Why? Well, the solution that we hear for high gas prices is a tax increase. Since when did raising taxes lower the price of gasoline? Since when does raising taxes on one thing ever lower the price of that thing? To me, this is just another distraction. Now, the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service has already told us that there are some common sense facts about energy taxes. They've told us that raising energy taxes will not lower the price at the pump. In fact, the Congressional Research Service says that increasing energy taxes will increase the price of gas and increase our dependence on foreign oil. This administration has consistently pushed policies that actually make the pain at the pump worse. You know, instead of supporting all of the above energy production across our country, they've been more focused on excuses about why we shouldn't use more American energy. You know, if you look back over time, there is a clear pattern. In 2008, when he was a candidate for president, then Senator Obama said that high gas prices weren't a problem. He said the only problem is that they went up too fast. Interior Secretary Salazar, when he was a member of this body, said that he would not support more offshore drilling. He said even if gas prices hit $10 a gallon. Even Secretary Stephen Chu, who was the Energy Secretary, was quoted that same year as saying, "We have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline," he said, "to the levels of Europe." Gas prices in Europe routinely hit $8 a gallon. Well, with these sorts of individuals in charge of our energy policy, it's no wonder that prices are way up over $1 from where they were a year ago. This administration's shutting down of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico is going to drive American oil production down by 20% in 2012. You know, even former President Bill Clinton called the continuous shutdown ridiculous. And to make matters worse, President Obama appears to be more enthusiastic about importing oil from other countries than he is in terms of using our own. You know, Brazil has discovered huge reserves of shale oil, and the President recently visited Brazil, and he said he wants the United States to be Brazil's best customer for oil. Well, when it comes to oil consumption generally, the President's story continues to change. A few weeks ago, President Obama tried to make the case that Americans should decrease their consumption of oil. He said, you know, we've only got about 2 to 3% of the world's oil reserves, and we use 25% of the world's oil. Well, according to the President's measurements, the United States has about 28 billion barrels of oil. But according to the Congressional Research Service, the United States actually has 163 billion barrels of oil. That's over 5 times as much as the President says we have. And the United States is currently the 3rd largest oil-producing nation in the world. President Obama has also said that he wants to cut imports of foreign oil by 1/3. Well, his new proposal is definitely a step in the right direction. So why would he tie it to a bill, this bill, that makes American production harder and more expensive? You know, another of the president's goals is to make alternative energy the cheapest form of energy. He continues to talk about that, and I applaud that goal. But we need to make energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can, and do it in ways that don't raise the prices for American families. Well, regrettably, the president's method has been to make everything but alternative energy more expensive. And the bill his party is pushing right now is another step in that direction. So the evidence is clear. The liberal energy strategy is not creating American jobs. No, it's not creating jobs here in America. It's not reducing the cost of gasoline in America. And it's not strengthening Americans' national security. Instead, Americans are paying more at the pump. They're living with high unemployment, and they are producing less American energy. Well, I hope the President will follow up on his promise to help America produce more oil. I also hope he'll stop pushing the damaging legislation that his party has put forward here this week. You know, it's time we have a true bipartisan approach on energy. Senator Manchin of West Virginia and I have introduced just such a bill. It's a bipartisan bill. It's called the American Alternative Fuels Act. This bill truly would ease Americans' pain at the pump. Fuels Act. This bill truly would ease Americans' pain at the pump. It would repeal barriers to alternative fuels so that American energy can thrive. It would promote the production of alternative fuels derived from American sources. This bill acknowledges the truth about our energy crisis. We need more American energy. We need it all. Well, in addition to the green jobs that the President keeps talking about, we need red, white, and blue energy and red, white, and blue energy jobs. We must keep focusing on making our energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can, and do it in ways that do not increase the cost on American families. The only way that Americans can take the President's call for more energy production seriously is if he and the Democrat leadership abandon their fixation on raising taxes on producing American energy. That is the first step we need to do in helping relieve pain at the pump. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Texas.
Yes. Unanimous consensus. The quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to speak in opposition to the Menendez proposal, which would raise taxes on a handful of our nation's energy producers. Mr. President, this bill makes the assumption that raising taxes on the 5 major oil companies will somehow reduce the deficit and lower the price at the pump. This is misguided, and it will also have the opposite effect. Raising taxes on our domestic oil industry will drive up gasoline prices, and who in America that is driving a truck or a car doesn't realize that gasoline prices are already very high? Secondly, it will threaten the jobs. 9 million jobs depend on drilling, exploration, and operating in America. If we drive these countries overseas, it will increase foreign imports and it will stop the jobs that are being created in America. Those who threaten to repeal these deductions fail to recognize the tremendous costs and risks that go into exploring for the energy needed to drive our country forward. Mr. President, our oil and gas industry is an industry, a business that creates jobs like any other industry or business in our country. Why would we single out one sector of our economy and say, you can't deduct your expenses? Every other business in America can deduct expenses. Other manufacturing businesses in America can get the taxes that are credited for manufacturing jobs because we want to keep jobs in America, and it offsets the very high corporate tax rate that we have in our country that the President has recognized as being too high. Because we want to keep manufacturing jobs, there is a credit for manufacturing. But we're going to take that away if the Menendez bill passes and send those jobs overseas. We are making it so hard to create our own natural resources from our own people working in this country, and we're sending them overseas at a time when we ought to be wanting to create jobs. We ought to be giving every possible fair break to companies that will hire in America. And yet now we're going to take one sector of the industry and tax them differently from every other sector. Since business started in our country, we have had tax deductions for expenses. And yet here we are trying to say that we're going to take one sector of the industry and maybe they're doing too well right now, and so we're going to tax them more. Well, look out other industries that happen to be successful right now, whether you're making Kleenex or computers, you're going to be taxed if you earn too much. I mean, is that really what America wants to change as our business policy, which is, has a foundation of fairness and equity? We have a corporate tax rate that is so high that it encourages businesses to go overseas. Now we're going to single out one industry that wants to do work in America, that wants to bring our natural resources out of the ground and bring down the price at the pump. But no, we're going to add taxes so that we will not see any lowering of gasoline prices at the pump. We're going to increase it. If we increase the cost of doing business and we force these companies to go overseas to get a fair and stable regulatory environment, then we're going to pay more at the pumps, no doubt about it. Now, Senator Landrieu and I introduced bipartisan legislation earlier this year called Senate Bill 516, the Lease Extension and Secure Act of 2011, known as the Lease Act. It restores time lost as a result of the offshore moratoria by extending the impacted leases by 1 year. It is fair and it is simple. Now, over the weekend, the President stated that he would be extending leases in the Gulf of Mexico that were affected by the moratorium, but he wasn't clear about which ones. He didn't say, I will extend every lease that went through the processes to get the environmental and the safety restrictions in place. They got the lease. Then they had a moratorium, so now they're paying people. They are continuing to have all of the expenses of the lease, but they don't get to do the exploration. What we're trying to do is say, whether you were in the exploration phase or in the drilling phase, it doesn't matter. If you are impacted by a moratorium on a lease that you're still paying for, and you're still paying people to try to keep people on the payroll, your lease will be extended for 1 year. That's all Senator Landrieu and I do. The Secretary of the Interior, at a hearing this morning in the Senate, said that they were looking into extending Gulf of Mexico wells directly impacted by the moratorium, meaning only those leaseholders which have already performed all seismic tests and were conducting exploration drilling. This will only cover 33 leases out of thousands that are still affected by the moratorium, because they are in the exploratory phase, not the exploratory drilling phase. This year alone, over 350 leases are due to expire. Many of them have not had the opportunity to be developed because of the moratorium. The development of oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico is an extremely expensive and technical process. It takes about 3 years of tests, surveys, and appraisals before even drilling for the exploration well. Regardless of which stage all of the exploration leaseholders are in, the administration had ordered all leaseholders to halt exploration activities when its moratorium was enacted. Every one of those leases are still being paid for, but they are not able to be explored. We need to restore at least 1 year of the moratorium so that they get fairness for the money that they have spent and also for the people that they have kept hired, not sending them away, which has been a hardship on many companies, including some having to go bankrupt because they could not afford to be idle while they also were meeting a payroll. The exploration and development of oil and gas must follow a meticulous process, and any delays, such as a moratorium, can derail an exploration plan, causing companies to have to give up on their leases. The length of a deepwater offshore lease is usually about 10 years, because that's what it takes to get all the way through the exploration and the exploration drilling phase to determine if it is worth actually drilling. And many times, when you drill, you get a dry well. Our common sense legislation has bipartisan support. Recently, the Office of Management and Budget stated the administration fully supports suspensions for Gulf of Mexico leaseholders directly impacted by the drilling moratorium. But the administration fails to recognize that all leaseholders in the Gulf of Mexico were directly impacted by the drilling moratorium. James Noe, the executive director of the Shallow Water Coalition, wrote me to express his support for the Lease Act. In the letter, he said, without the Lease Act, vast quantities of proven, present, and producible oil and gas in these expiring leases will be trapped. Leaving the resources trapped will hurt our domestic production and delay when these resources can come online. I received another letter from Stephen Heitzman, the president and CEO of Phoenix Exploration, a small Houston-based exploration company. Mr. Heitzman wrote that the Lease Act is vital to Phoenix Exploration and other small offshore companies because they have been prevented by the administration from drilling in the moratorium and have not been able to even evaluate many of their Gulf of Mexico leases which have been fully paid for through the competitive bidding process. He goes on to say that the time lost from the moratorium makes it very difficult for shallow water independent operators to put together the partnerships and attract sufficient capital resources needed to develop leases. The Lease Act is needed to give offshore energy producers the certainty they need to obtain proper financing to produce domestic oil and gas. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to put the letters that I have read excerpts from in the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, let me just close by saying that I hope that we will not do something so wrong-headed and counterintuitive as to take one section of an industry and say, you're bigger than all of the others, and so we're going to tax you differently. We're not going to give you the manufacturing tax credits that we give to every other manufacturer in the world, including the big ones that manufacture in the United States. And we are also going to tax you differently from the smaller oil and gas companies because you're big and they're small. Mr. President, I mean, really, is that America? Is that the country that wrote a constitution that said we would guarantee due process of law, that you wouldn't single out one company that is bigger than the others and tax it differently? That's not what our country was founded on. We should have a fair process. We should have fair taxation. We should be encouraging manufacturing in our country because these companies have a trust with their shareholders. We expect them to do well for their shareholders, and they have millions of shareholders that depend on them to do the right thing with their business and with the investment that these shareholders have made. I might add that many pensions are dependent on these kinds of stocks that expect the CEOs to run the companies in a way that will keep our economy going, keep jobs in America, and keep their stockholders in a position where retirees can live on the income. And, Mr. President, we are singling out an industry and saying, no, you're too big, and so you're going to be taxed differently from other industries. And you don't get the manufacturing incentives that even other big manufacturers get. Why wouldn't they move overseas to create jobs overseas where they have a stable regulatory environment, a lower tax base, a lower tax rate, and where they can bring oil up from the ground and import it right back into America? But it will be at a higher price because you're going to have to pay for the people to go overseas and haul the oil back. Does that really make sense, Mr. President? It doesn't make good business sense, and it certainly doesn't make good economic sense. It's not good for our country, and it's certainly not good for the job market that we are trying to build. So I hope that we will not make the mistake of going forward on the Menendez bill. I hope that we will realize that we are a country that has vast natural resources, and we should be using those resources so that our businesses can thrive, so that prices stay low, so that people will not be strained to put gasoline in their trucks to go to work or to do their farming or ranching to contribute back to the economy. I hope that we will defeat the Menendez bill, and I hope that we will adopt a policy that will come through the McConnell bill tomorrow that will increase exploration, increase production, lower the price of gasoline through our own natural resources, not by importing our own, the jobs that ought to be in America, exporting the jobs and importing the product. That doesn't make sense. Let's keep the jobs in America, and let's keep our natural resources working for us. That would be the prudent thing to do, and that will be the McConnell bill. And I hope we can defeat the Menendez bill, and maybe we can come together in the Senate and give the President a bill that will ask that we have more production and give the level playing field to all of the companies that would hire more people and create jobs in America. And they will do it if there is a level and fair and stable regulatory and tax environment in America. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.